Raj's life was a meticulously folded napkin. Every day, the same creases, the same slight starchiness, the same predictable placement beside a lukewarm cup of instant coffee. His cubicle, a beige sarcophagus in a sea of beige sarcophagi, hummed with the low thrum of office air conditioning and the distant tap-tap-tap of keyboards. He sorted data, he input figures, he generated reports that no one seemed to read. His evenings were a blur of reheated meals and forgotten television shows, punctuated by the nagging suspicion that he was slowly, imperceptibly fading into the wallpaper. He was 32, single, and felt a quiet despair settle over him like fine dust. Then came the letter. Not an email, not a text, but a thick, cream-colored envelope addressed to him in elegant, looping script. It arrived on a Tuesday, wedged between a utility bill and a takeaway menu. The return address was a law firm he'd never heard of, in a town he'd never visited. Raj, usually a man of meticulous routine, opened it with a flicker of something akin to curiosity. It informed him, in crisp legal jargon, of the passing of a distant relative. A great-uncle named Arthur, who Raj had no memory of ever meeting, let alone knowing existed. And then came the unexpected. Arthur had left Raj his entire estate. Raj read the words, "ancestral estate," and pictured a quaint cottage, perhaps a small, overgrown garden, a quiet escape from the beige. He called the solicitor, a Mr. Finch, the next morning. "The estate, Mr. Raj," Finch's voice was dry and precise, "is a rather unique property. It's located in what was once a significant industrial area, now mostly abandoned. A factory, to be exact, the Sophia Iron Works." Raj blinked, the phone pressed to his ear. A factory? Not a cottage, not a garden, but a derelict factory? The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. A factory? Indeed. It's been dormant for over 50 years. A considerable parcel of land, however. And the will is quite explicit. You are the sole heir. Finch paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "There are certain conditions. You must take possession in person, and you must spend at least one night there within the first month of inheritance. A formality, Raj assure you. A formality." Raj tried to picture it. The dust, the rust, the echoing emptiness. It sounded less like an inheritance and more like a penance. Yet, a sliver of something stirred within him. An impulse, foreign and insistent. It was an escape, however grim. Anything was better than the beige. He took a week off work, packed a small bag, and set off. The journey was long, the landscape slowly transforming from manicured suburbs to sprawling, neglected fields, then to the skeletal remains of forgotten industry. The road narrowed, cracked, and eventually devolved into a gravel track. His GPS, usually so confident, stuttered and lost signal, leaving him to navigate by the vague directions Finch had provided. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic. A faint, acrid tang. The sky, which had been a clear blue that morning, had bruised to an ominous gray. He rounded a bend, and there it was. The Sophia Iron Works. It wasn't just a factory, it was a behemoth. A sprawling, hulking mass of rust-streaked brick and grimy, broken windows that stared out like vacant eyes. Its sheer scale was oppressive, dwarfing the overgrown trees that clawed at its base. A colossal, wrought iron gate, half off its hinges, groaned in a breath of wind that seemed to sigh from the structure itself. Beyond it, a cracked asphalt driveway disappeared into a wilderness of weeds and choked undergrowth. Raj parked his modest sedan beside the gate, the engine dying with a final shuddering cough. There were no other cars, no signs of life, no hint of humanity for miles around. He was utterly, completely alone. He pushed the heavy gate open. It screamed on its rusty hinges, a sound that scraped against his teeth. More organic. The interior was a cathedral of forgotten industry. Dust motes danced in the sparse light filtering through the high, broken windows, illuminating vast, silent machinery draped in cobwebs and a thick gray film of grime. Gigantic gears, rusted solid, stood like petrified beasts. Overhead cranes, their chains hanging slack, were frozen mid-traverse. The sheer volume of the space was overwhelming, the echoes of his own footsteps swallowed almost instantly. A profound sense of isolation settled over him, heavier than the dust. This wasn't just an empty building. It felt occupied. Not by people, but by a lingering presence, a memory etched into the very fabric of the walls. He shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. The formality, Finch had called it. But as he stood amidst the silent, rusting giants, Raj knew with a certainty that prickled his skin that this was no mere formality. This was a challenge. And the factory, it seemed, was already watching. He had a job to do, a survey to complete. This wasn't some haunted house. It was a derelict factory, a monument to industrial decay. He switched on the powerful beam of his flashlight, cutting a swathe through the gloom. The air, thick with the scent of rust, damp earth, and something else. Something indefinably stale, like a memory long forgotten, seemed to resist the light, swallowing its edges. The vast main floor stretched before him, an echoing cavern of shattered dreams. Overhead, skeletal girders crisscrossed the vaulted ceiling, draped in cobwebs like ancient tapestries. Rust-eaten machinery, hulking and silent, stood frozen in postures of perpetual toil, their gears locked, their belts rotted away. Dust, fine and powdery, lay like a shroud over everything, disturbed only by his heavy boots. Each step sent small clouds puffing upwards, briefly catching the flashlight's beam before settling again. He moved slowly, methodically, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage. His instructions were to document anything unusual, and the factory provided an abundance of the expected. Then, nestled between the shattered remains of what might have been a control panel and a pile of grimy industrial rags, he saw it. A locket. Not an industrial component, not a discarded worker's tool. It was small, tarnished silver, delicate, and utterly out of place. He picked it up. The clasp was broken, and inside, the faded sepia photograph of a young woman, her smile a ghost of warmth, stared back at him. Her eyes, even in the faded image, seemed to hold a quiet sadness. A low, drawn-out groan echoed from somewhere deeper within the factory, making him jump. It sounded like the building itself was sighing under the weight of its own decay. Or was it just the wind? He listened, but the sound didn't repeat. He pocketed the locket, a strange curiosity overriding his initial unease. This was definitely unusual. Further on, past a collapsed section of catwalk, he found a small, grimy office, its door hanging by a single hinge. Inside, a desk was overturned, papers scattered like autumn leaves. But on a high, dusty shelf, almost hidden by a stack of defunct circuit boards, sat a leather-bound ledger. Unlike the other papers, it seemed deliberately placed, almost protected. He pulled it down. The pages were brittle, filled with elegant looping script. Not production figures, not inventory. It was a diary, simply read, "They know I see them. They want me to join." Raj's breath hitched. It was fleeting, indistinct, like dry leaves skittering across concrete, yet it held a distinct, breathy quality. He spun around, flashlight beam darting, but the small office was empty save for the dust motes dancing in the light. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He wasn't alone. That feeling, that presence, it was strengthening. He pushed deeper, the diary clutched in his hand. The factory narrowed into a labyrinth of smaller workshops and storage rooms. In one, crammed with rusting pipes and coils of ancient wiring, He noticed an irregularity. A section of the back wall, behind a precarious stack of empty oil drums, seemed too new, too clean, compared to the surrounding grime. He nudged an oil drum, then another, until a gap appeared. Behind them, a roughly cut doorway, barely wide enough for a man, was revealed. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to report the locket and the diary, to leave this place. But a different, more primal urge, a morbid curiosity, pulled him forward. He squeezed through the opening. The passage was narrow, unlit, and smelled faintly of stagnant water and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. The passage twisted, then opened into a small, irregular chamber. And there, in the periphery of his vision, a flicker. He stood frozen, listening. Nothing but the frantic thump of his own blood. Then his beam fell upon it. A small wooden doll, crudely carved with empty sockets where eyes should have been. It sat upright on a stone slab in the center of the chamber, facing the entrance, as if waiting. Around its neck, tied with a length of brittle twine, hung a single silver locket, identical to the one in his pocket. This wasn't just a derelict factory. It was a tomb, a prison, or perhaps something far worse. And he had just walked right into its heart. The profound sense of isolation he'd felt earlier had been a warning. Now it was a terrifying reality. He was not alone, and whatever was here was watching. Raj stumbled back, hitting the rough wall of the passage. He scrambled away from the hidden room, the stench of decay and something else. Something profoundly wrong, clinging to his clothes, his skin. The factory, a hulking monument to forgotten industry, seemed to watch him, its broken windows like dead eyes. He didn't look back. He needed answers. And the only place to find them, he reasoned, was the nearby town. It was a long walk, the path overgrown and indistinct, winding through skeletal trees and tracks of desolate, waterlogged fields. Each rustle in the undergrowth, each distant call of a bird, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the land itself was watching, waiting. Finally, a faint glow appeared in the gathering gloom. The first streetlights of Oakhaven. The town emerged from the mist like a half-forgotten memory, a cluster of stone buildings huddled together against the encroaching wildness. It wasn't large, perhaps a few hundred souls, and it possessed the weary air of a place that had seen better, busier days. The streets were quiet, almost unnervingly so. A few porch lights cast weak circles onto empty pavements. Raj found the only establishment that seemed to be open, a small, dimly lit pub named the Black Boar. A weathered sign depicting a snarling hog creaked in the breeze above the heavy oak door. Only a handful of patrons occupied the place. An elderly man with a gnarled face sat hunched over a pint in a corner, his gaze fixed on the flickering embers of a stone fireplace. The barkeeper, a woman with tired eyes and a perpetually worried frown, was polishing glasses behind the counter. All eyes, it seemed, turned to Raj the moment he stepped inside. The conversations died. "Evenin'," the barkeeper said, her voice flat, devoid of warmth. "And I was hoping to ask a few questions if you don't mind." Her eyes narrowed. "About what?" "The old factory, and the estate it's part of. My family owned it generations ago." A sharp intake of breath from the couple by the window. The old man in the corner stirred, his head lifting slightly. The barkeeper's hand paused on a glass. "It's been empty for decades, best left that way. I'm here to see about clearing it up, perhaps selling it," Raj pressed, sensing their unease. "I need to know what I'm dealing with." The barkeeper hesitated, glancing at the other patrons. "Some things," he rasped, his voice surprisingly strong for his age, "ain't meant to be cleared up, lad. Some things just fester." "What happened there?" Raj asked, his voice low. "I've heard strange things." The barkeeper wrung her cloth. The family that owned it. The last ones, anyway. They were peculiar, kept to themselves. Then there was the fever, or what they called the fever. Took most of them, so they said. And the others? The old man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Others just vanished. The youngest girl, she was a pretty thing. Played with dolls, they said. Then one day she was gone. Her mother, she went mad searching. Screamed through the woods at night, calling her name. They found her eventually, by the old well. Never looked the same after that. He locked himself away in that factory, the barkeeper continued, her gaze distant, as if seeing something beyond the pub's walls. Tried to fix something, they said. Meddle with things best left alone. Built strange contraptions. Heard screams from there, even in town on the wind. What kind of screams? The old man scoffed. Not human ones, lad. Not entirely. They said he was trying to bring her back. The little girl. Or maybe just keep her close. He took a long swig of his beer, his eyes meeting Raj's, ancient and knowing. That place ain't right. It's got a hunger, always has. Your family, they fed it. The couple by the window suddenly stood, their chairs scraping loudly on the floor. We should be going, the man mumbled, pulling his partner towards the door. They hurried out, their footsteps echoing quickly down the street. The barkeeper poured Raj's coffee, her hands trembling slightly. You should leave, son. Go back where you came from. Malevolent presence that hung over the land itself. It was real. He felt the weight of generations pressing down on him, a legacy of horror he had unwittingly inherited. He paid for the coffee he hadn't touched, the money feeling like a bribe for the terrible truths he'd unearthed. He was already caught. Threads that led inexorably back to the derelict factory. He didn't know what he was looking for, but a frantic instinct now clawed at him, demanding he return. The factory wasn't just a building, it was a mausoleum of secrets, and he, Raj, was its reluctant heir. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the western sky in bruised purples and oranges that did little to dispel the gloom settling over the industrial ruins. The chain-link fence, once a barrier, now seemed more like a gateway. He slipped through the gap he'd found earlier, the metallic groan of familiar, unwelcome greeting. The previous day's exploration had been aimless, driven by curiosity. Today, a desperate clarity guided him. The terrible truths had pointed to a deeper, more insidious connection between his family and this place, hinting at something hidden, something kept. He moved through the main floor, his gaze sharper, more discerning. He wasn't looking for a dropped tool or a forgotten blueprint. He was looking for an anomaly, a seam in the fabric of decay. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something metallic and faint, like old blood. His eyes fell upon a section of wall near the factory's original office. A small, enclosed space that had clearly once been a private study. Different. A subtle lack of continuity in the grain. A faint line where two panels met, barely perceptible. He pressed his fingers against it, feeling for a give, a latch, anything. Nothing. Frustration began to prickle, but then he noticed it. A small, almost invisible indentation in the molding of the adjacent doorframe, no bigger than his thumbprint. He pressed it. There was a soft, almost inaudible click, followed by a low groan of ancient wood and rusty hinges. A section of the paneling, perhaps 3 feet wide, swung inward with agonizing slowness, revealing a narrow, dust-choked passage. Raj's breath hitched. The passage led into a small, windowless room, barely large enough to stand in, its walls lined with shelves of decaying documents and forgotten artifacts. In the center, on a small, rickety table, sat a single item, shrouded in a thin layer of dust. It was a book. Not a modern-bound volume, but a heavy, leather-bound journal. Its cover embossed with a faded, intricate symbol. A serpent coiling around a stylized, bleeding heart. The first page bore a name, almost entirely obscured by time. A.K. Varma, followed by a date. October 1888. His great-great-grandfather. With trembling hands, Raj opened the journal. The first entries were mundane, details of factory operations. But as he flipped further, the tone shifted. He stopped on a page, his eyes snagging on a specific passage. It watches. It has always watched. The ground itself breathes with its hunger. His father spoke of it in hushed tones, his grandfather before him. A malevolent presence, older than this land, older than man's memory, awakened by the tearing of the earth for the factory's foundation. They built upon its slumber, and in doing so, they roused it. He turned the page, his heart hammering against his ribs. It feeds on fear, on grief, on the despair of those bound to this accursed place. It demands a keeper, a family to tend its hunger, to ensure its sustenance. And they, the Varmas, are that family. The factory, this land, is its cage and its larder. They are its shepherds and its sheep. The words blurred before Raj's eyes, the horror of them almost physical. A keeper, a family curse. This wasn't just about his great-uncle's madness or his father's strange distance. This was a generational torment, an invisible parasite draining his lineage dry. He wasn't just an heir to a defunct business. He was heir to a terrifying ancient burden. The terrible truths he'd unearthed were only the preamble. The real horror had just begun to reveal itself, written in the frantic hand of a long-dead ancestor, binding him irrevocably to the monstrous hunger beneath his very feet. The words blurred before Raj's eyes, the horror of them almost physical. This was about him. He slammed it shut, the sound echoing through the vast, empty space of the factory, a stark contrast to the thumping of his own heart. He tried to rationalize it, a deluded old man's ramblings. A fever dream committed to paper, now felt less like imagination and more like a premonition. He gathered his tools, shoving them haphazardly into his bag, a desperate need to escape this suffocating place overriding his meticulous nature. He spun around, his breath catching, but there was nothing. Only the groaning of the old building, settling deeper into its decay. He told himself it was the wind, whistling through broken panes. But the factory was sealed, a tomb of rust and forgotten industry. That night, sleep offered no refuge. Raj plunged into a nightmare so vivid, so visceral, it felt less like a dream and more like a parallel reality. He was back in the factory, but it was alive, pulsating with an unseen presence. The walls wept black ichor. The concrete floor writhed like a living thing. You are the keeper. He saw his great-uncle, not as the frail man in the photograph, but as a gaunt, terrified figure, his eyes wide with an unspeakable horror. He woke with a strangled cry, drenched in sweat, the phantom weight of metal still biting into his skin. The sun, when it finally rose, offered little comfort. The nightmare lingered, a suffocating shroud around his consciousness. He tried to work, to focus on the task at hand, securing a section of the collapsed roof. But his hands trembled, his concentration shattered. Every creak, every groan of the factory became amplified, imbued with a sinister intent. He'd turn, his heart hammering against his ribs, only to find nothing but the empty, decaying vastness. Raj. It was too clear, too distinct to be imagination. Who's there? His voice cracked, swallowed by the cavernous space. Then a sudden violent shudder ripped through the factory. Not the wind, not the settling of old beams. This was an internal tremor, as if something vast and powerful was stirring beneath the very floorboards. tools clattered from a workbench, scattering across the concrete with a deafening crash. A heavy chain, hanging from an overhead crane, began to swing, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, arcing through the air as if pushed by an invisible hand. Raj stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He watched, mesmerized and terrified, as the chain swung faster, the air whistling around it. A high-pitched keening sound, like metal screaming, began to emanate from the depths of the factory, rising in volume, piercing his ears. The temperature plummeted, and his breath plumed in front of him. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was here. And it was angry. He felt a distinct, icy touch on his shoulder, a pressure that was undeniably physical, though no one was there. He cried out, scrambling backwards, tripping over a loose piece of rebar. He fell hard, his head hitting the concrete, stars exploding behind his eyes. As he lay there, dazed and disoriented, the keening sound intensified, morphing into a guttural roar that vibrated through the very floor. The heavy chain snapped, crashing to the ground with a thunderous clang that echoed like a death knell. This wasn't a curse he could ignore, or a madness he could dismiss. This was an entity, a monstrous thing that had been roused, and it was making its presence known. The factory wasn't just derelict, it was a cage, and he, Raj, was trapped inside with something ancient and terrifying that now saw him as its keeper. His safety, his very mind, was dissolving in the face of escalating horror. Raj pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest, his mind reeling. His sanity was fraying, tearing at the edges. This wasn't a curse he could ignore. This was a hunt. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The derelict factory, once a refuge of forgotten industry, now felt like a mausoleum. He stumbled towards the makeshift camp he'd set up in a relatively dry corner, a tattered tarp strung between two rusted pillars. His laptop, an old model barely clinging to life, was his only connection to the outside world, to any knowledge that might save him. His fingers, trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline, fumbled with the power brick. The outlet, surprisingly still functional in this crumbling edifice, sparked faintly as he plugged it in. He had downloaded a small library of texts. Occult history, local folklore, forgotten industrial accidents. He began with the factory's history, searching for any mention of strange occurrences, unexplained deaths, or unusual cult activity. The records were sparse, mostly mundane financial reports and employee rosters. But then, a few fragmented news clippings from the early 20th century caught his eye. A rash of disappearances, a series of bizarre accidents, workers driven to madness. As he delved deeper, the laptop's fan whirred louder, a frantic, desperate sound. He typed furiously, keywords flashing across the screen. Local legends, factory hauntings, ancient entities, spirit traps. His eyes burned, but he couldn't stop. He felt an urgency that went beyond his own fear, a sense of being watched, of time running out. He pulled out his phone, a lifeline he hadn't dared to use in days. No signal, of course. He'd tried before, but the network always seemed to vanish the deeper he ventured into the factory's heart. Now, even from his camp, it was dead. He tried to call Raj, his only remaining contact, but the call wouldn't connect. A gnawing sense of isolation began to settle in, thick and suffocating. Hours bled into one another. Raj's stomach growled, but the thought of food was repulsive, drawn to places of suffering and industry. It was said to be formless, shapeless, manifesting only through the emotions it preyed upon, subtly twisting reality around its victims. Subtly twisting reality. The phrase echoed in his mind. He looked around. The familiar creaks and groans of the factory took on a sinister rhythm, like a slow, deliberate breathing. A stack of rusted pipes he'd propped against a wall last night now lay scattered across the floor, as if casually pushed aside. He knew he hadn't done it. He tried to connect to the factory's old, defunct internal network, a desperate hope for forgotten blueprints, anything that might reveal a hidden chamber, a weakness. The connection failed. He tried again, and again. He pounded on the keys, but it was useless. The battery, fully charged just moments ago, was dead. Panic began to claw at his throat. He was cut off. Completely. He could feel it closing in. The entity wasn't just observing, it was actively severing his ties, tightening the invisible noose. He stood up, his legs stiff, his muscles screaming. He needed a way out, a physical escape, but every path felt like a trap. He tried the main gates. The heavy, rusted iron doors, which he'd managed to pry open a crack just yesterday, were now sealed shut. He pushed, pulled, shoulder-charged, but they wouldn't budge. It was as if a colossal, unseen force held them fast. He stumbled back, his breath ragged. He tried another exit, a smaller service door he'd used for supplies. Locked. The ancient, corroded padlock, which had been broken open for years, was now firmly secured, gleaming faintly in the dim light as if freshly oiled. Raj's mind raced, a frantic hamster on a wheel. He was losing it. He found himself back in his makeshift camp, huddled, clutching the useless laptop like a shield. He looked down at the last page he'd managed to read on the laptop before it died. A single line stood out, seared into his memory. It cannot be killed, only contained. And containment requires a sacrifice, a binding. A binding, a sacrifice. He was researching his own demise. The entity wasn't just manipulating his surroundings, it was manipulating him, guiding him towards a specific, horrific conclusion. He was trapped, not just by physical barriers, but by the very knowledge he had so desperately sought. The hunt was over. The capture had begun. Raj's mind raced, a frantic kaleidoscope of ancient texts and desperate strategies. He was no longer an observer. He was prey. The words from the previous night echoed, not just in his ears, but in the very marrow of his bones. He had to act, and fast. His research, a frantic dive into forbidden lore, had unearthed a potential weakness. Some entities, bound by blood and ritual to a physical space, drew their power from specific energy conduits, almost like veins in the earth. Disrupting these ley currents or creating a localized null field could, theoretically, sever the entity's immediate connection, or at least render him momentarily invisible to its perception. The key, according to one obscure, half-burnt manuscript, lay in a specific arrangement of grounded iron and powdered dolomite, forming a counter-sigil. The derelict factory, a sprawling labyrinth of forgotten industry, was rich in both. His flashlight beam danced across cracked concrete, revealing discarded tools, heaps of corroded metal, and a fine, pervasive layer of industrial dust that coated everything. He found a section of the main floor, relatively clear, where he believed a major energy conduit might run. Based on the factory's original layout blueprints he'd managed to find online. First, the iron. He wrestled a heavy, detached section of an old conveyor belt, dragging its jagged edge across the floor, leaving a scraping trail. He positioned it carefully, then began to arrange smaller, heavier gears and plates, forming the outer perimeter of his makeshift sigil. The effort left him sweating, his muscles screaming, but the adrenaline pushed him on. Next, the dolomite. He'd spent the better part of an hour earlier, chipping away at a section of crumbling concrete wall he suspected was rich in the mineral, grinding it into a fine powder with a heavy wrench and a flat piece of steel. Now, with trembling hands, he began to sprinkle the pale dust along the inner edge of his iron perimeter, forming intricate lines and loops, replicating the ancient diagram as best he could remember. He was almost done. Just one more connecting line of powder, completing the circuit, and then he would step into the heart of the sigil, hoping it would offer him even a moment of reprieve, a chance to think, to plan his next move. His hand, caked in white dust, hovered over the final point. A low groan, deeper than any structural shift, vibrated through the factory floor. It wasn't the sound of metal contracting or settling. It was a sound that seemed to come from within. The very earth, resonating with a sinister intelligence. Raj froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The lines blurred, the meticulously drawn loops twisting into smudges. It spread slowly, deliberately, consuming the dolomite, dissolving it. The iron pieces, meant to ground and protect, seemed to grow heavy, sinking slightly into the floor, pulled by an invisible hand. The countermeasure was not merely failing. It was being actively undone, its very components turning against him. Then, with a sickening lurch, the floor beneath him shuddered. A massive section of concrete directly in the center of his incomplete sigil cracked violently. The fissure spread like a spiderweb, radiating outwards, and with a deafening roar of grinding stone and tearing metal, the section gave way. Raj screamed, a raw, terrified sound, plummeting downwards. He scrabbled for purchase, his fingers tearing on jagged rebar and crumbling concrete, but found nothing. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, his head slamming against something unyielding. Pain exploded behind his eyes. He lay there, stunned, gasping for air, the smell of damp earth and decay filling his nostrils. His flashlight, having flown from his hand, lay several feet away, its beam weakly illuminating a narrow, cramped space. He was in some kind of sub-basement, a forgotten crawl space beneath the factory floor, choked with debris and skeletal pipes. Above him, the gaping maw where the floor had been was now just a distant, impossibly small square of dim light. He was truly trapped, deeper within the factory's suffocating embrace. The entity hadn't just thwarted his escape. It had anticipated it, used his own efforts to hurt him exactly where it wanted him. The trap had closed. The gaping maw above him, once a distant square of dim light, now seemed to have swallowed the last vestiges of the world he knew. Raj was truly trapped, deeper within the derelict factory than he'd ever imagined possible. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of rust, damp earth, and something else. A faint metallic sweetness that prickled the back of his throat. He was in a vast subterranean chamber, far larger than any he'd encountered above. The floor was uneven, a mix of packed earth and jagged, broken concrete, strewn with skeletal remains of machinery that looked too old, too corroded, to have ever functioned. The walls, however, were the most disturbing. They weren't the crumbling brick or corrugated metal of the factory's upper levels. It felt less like a factory and more like a tomb. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the floor, a resonant frequency that seemed to shake his very bones. It wasn't mechanical. It was biological, ancient, a sound from the earth itself. Raj stumbled forward, his breath catching in his throat. His light caught on a series of carvings etched into the stone wall. They weren't the crude graffiti he'd seen before. These were symbols, intricate and disturbing, depicting twisted figures with elongated limbs and vacant, staring eyes, engaged in what looked like ritualistic acts. Below them, a recurring motif. A jagged, five-pointed star, almost like a claw mark. He recognized it. He'd seen that star before, etched into the silver locket his grandmother had always worn, a family heirloom passed down for generations. He'd always dismissed it as a stylized crest, a peculiar family emblem. Now, illuminated by his phone's weak beam, it pulsed with a horrifying new meaning. The further he walked, the more pronounced the carvings became, growing into a grotesque narrative. They chronicled a lineage, a progression of figures, each bearing the star mark, each engaged in a pact. It wasn't just in the factory, it was of this place, and it was tied to them. Upon it lay a single open book, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The hum intensified, a low growl that filled the space, pressing against his eardrums. He forced himself to look. The script was archaic, but the illustrations were horrifyingly clear. Sketches of his ancestors, some bearing an uncanny resemblance to old family photographs, stood around an altar, their hands raised in supplication. A man Raj had only known through sepia-toned photographs stood before the gaping maw of the entity, a knife raised high, a look of grim determination on his face. The text beneath, though difficult to decipher, contained recurring phrases that burned themselves into Raj's mind. The pact, the sustenance, the bloodline's burden. And then a name, scrawled in a flowing hand that felt sickeningly familiar. Rajesh. It was his own name, or rather, the name of his great-grandfather. A name that had been passed down through generations, always skipping a generation, always waiting. The metallic sweetness in the air intensified, becoming cloying, sickeningly sweet, like old blood. Raj stumbled back, the book clattering to the stone. The truth, raw and horrifying, crashed down upon him. This wasn't just a place of evil. It was his family's legacy. His ancestors hadn't just discovered the entity, they had bound themselves to it, perhaps to gain power, perhaps to escape some greater doom, but at a terrible price. They had fed it, sustained it, ensured its continued existence within these walls. And he, Raj, was the inheritor of that pact. The bloodline's burden. He wasn't just trapped in the factory, he was bound to its fate. To its fate. He was the next offering, the next link in the chain, the next Rajesh. The entity wasn't just hunting him, it was claiming him, a debt long overdue. He wasn't a stranger here. He was a descendant, a sacrifice waiting to be made. It knew. It had always known. The weight of the revelation pressed down on Raj, heavier than any physical burden. He wasn't merely a victim caught in a cursed place. He was the linchpin, the inheritor, the final link in a chain forged in desperation and blood. The factory wasn't just a prison for it. It was a cage for his very bloodline, and he, Raj, was the one holding the keys. Or perhaps the one who was the key. His gaze swept the decaying office, now a tomb of forgotten hopes. The dust-laden desk, the scattered papers, the very air thick with the residue of despair. He ran a hand along a loose panel in the wall, half-rotten wood giving way with a soft groan. It was his ancestor's hand, detailing the pact, the slow corruption, and crucially, the desperate, terrible means of its undoing. The journal spoke of a severing of the root, a ritual not of banishment, but of absolute termination. It wasn't about driving the entity away, but about starving it, cutting off its lifeblood, the very lineage that had sustained it. The price was laid bare in stark, horrifying terms. The first fruit of the inheritor's future, offered not in life. It meant sacrificing his own potential, his future, the very continuation of his bloodline. He would become the end, the final ember, ensuring that no future generation would ever bear this curse, but at the cost of that future itself. It was the ultimate solitary act of defiance. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, pressing down on him, trying to crush his resolve. It knew what he intended. The journal guided him to the factory's core, the oldest section, where the original foundry once roared. A massive circular grate covered a deep pit in the floor, its metal scarred and ancient, a relic of forgotten industry. This was it. The place where the first pact was made, where the entity had first taken root. The instructions were precise, grim. He had to draw his own blood, not as a wound of pain, but as an offering of essence. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the metallic tang of fear in his mouth. He found a shard of rusted metal, sharp enough, near a fallen beam. His hand trembled as he pressed it against his palm, the skin protesting before yielding, a bead of crimson welling up. The moment his blood touched the metal, a low, guttural shriek tore through the factory, shaking the very foundations. The next step, the incantation. His voice, hoarse and trembling, filled the echoing space. The words were ancient, guttural, a desperate plea and a defiant curse. As he spoke, the floor beneath him vibrated violently. He could feel its rage, a searing, intelligent fury that sought to consume him entirely. He reached the final words, his voice raw, his body racked with pain and fear. "I sever the root, I end the line, no more shall you feed." With the last syllable, he had to make the symbolic offering. He closed his eyes, picturing his future, a life unburdened, a family, a legacy. Then, with a wrenching cry that tore from his soul, he consciously, deliberately, willed it away. He offered the potential of his bloodline, the very hope of its continuation, as the ultimate, terrible sacrifice. The factory erupted. A deafening roar, a sound of pure agony and impotent rage ripped through the air. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Metal groaned, and then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. He was alive, but the world felt fundamentally changed. The air was still, clean, yet he felt profoundly, irrevocably empty. He had paid the price. He had made the sacrifice. But had it worked? Was the entity truly gone? He slowly pulled his hand away, leaving a final bloody print on the ancient iron. The sudden vacuum of sound and pressure was almost as disorienting as the torment had been. His ears rang with the echo of their absence, a high-pitched whine that seemed to bore directly into his skull. His entire body ached, a deep, throbbing protest from every muscle and bone. He felt bruised in places he couldn't see, as if an invisible force had been trying to tear him apart from the inside out. They were gone, he told himself. But the memory was burned into his retinas, a permanent stain. Slowly, carefully, he pushed himself up, his limbs stiff and uncooperative. The vast machines, once looming threats, now stood as silent skeletal sentinels. The dripping pipes, the groaning metal, the scuttling rats. All the ordinary factory noises seemed amplified in the profound quiet. He was alive. He had survived. Survival implied triumph, a victory over an adversary. This felt more like a reprieve, a temporary cessation of hostilities. The entity hadn't been defeated, not truly. It hadn't been vanquished by some heroic act. It had simply retreated. Like a tide pulling back from the shore, leaving behind a desolate landscape, waiting for the moon to draw it back in. He reached a trembling hand to his chest, feeling the frantic thump of his heart against his ribs. He started to walk, one faltering step after another, towards the gaping maw of the main loading bay, the way he had come in. He knew they weren't real, not anymore. But his mind, scarred and raw, couldn't tell the difference. The factory itself seemed to breathe around him, a vast, wounded beast. He had thought, in his youthful naivety, that evil was a tangible thing, something that could be fought, contained, defeated. Some evils weren't things you fought. They were states of being, permeating the very fabric of existence, waiting for an opportunity to manifest. They couldn't be killed because they weren't truly alive in the way he understood it. They simply were. He reached the loading bay, the massive rusted door ajar, letting in a sliver of the pre-dawn gloom. He pushed it open further, the screech of metal on metal echoing like a scream. He stepped out, into the cool, damp air of the outside world. The sky was a bruised purple, the first hint of morning trying to break through the lingering night. He couldn't. He just kept walking, away from the factory, away from the echoes, away from the profound emptiness that now resided within him. He was alive, yes, But he was profoundly, irrevocably changed. The vibrant, curious man who had entered that factory was gone, replaced by a haunted shell. It was merely waiting. And it would remember him. Raj was free, but he would never truly be free again.